Fresh Outlook. I'm Frank Cipolla. This week, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down a portion of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The change will allow 9 states, mostly in the South, to change their election laws with approval, or I should say without approval from the federal government. Is it a change whose time has come, or will it make it even harder for the poor and disadvantaged to exercise their right to vote? Take a look.
When President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law in 1965, Sections 4 and 5 mandated 9 southern states and local governments in 7 other states to consult the U.S. Justice Department for approval to change any of their voting codes and laws. The Supreme Court, now in 2013, agrees with a suit brought by a town in Alabama that says times have changed and that type of oversight isn't necessary anymore. President Obama calls the High Court's decision a setback. The Vice President had this to say.
Like so many across the country, I'm disappointed in the Supreme Court's decision today you may or may not have heard of in Shelby County versus Holder, the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act, the cornerstone of the American Civil Rights Movement.
While Chief Justice John Roberts said in his majority opinion that the court's decision in no way affects the permanent nationwide ban on racial discrimination in voting, civil rights groups and the U.S. Attorney General disagree.
Like many others across the country, I am deeply disappointed with the court's decision in this matter. This decision represents a serious setback for voting rights and has the potential to negatively affect millions of Americans across the country.
Professor? Now, to discuss this important ruling, we welcome back Republican strategist Dee Dee Benkie and Professor Yohuru, I said your name right 4 times during the commercial break, Yohuru Williams.
Yes.
He is a professor of African Studies at Fairfield University and media expert, and also Professor Jackie Guzda. Welcome. All right, so this was a fairly momentous ruling. It took out a part that many people say was probably the most important part of it, which required some of these southern states to get federal approval before they changed the Voting Rights Act as they set up their voting rights. Let me speak as somebody who hasn't really been following this, and I have, but let me speak as the viewer. What does this all mean? What does it mean? What happened? We'll start with you, Professor.
Very momentous legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1965 was because it addressed the historic injustices that were done to voters in the South, particularly African Americans, where what you had were changes in election laws, sometimes on election day, that prohibited black voters from being able to go to the poll and exercise the right to vote. What the Civil Rights Act of 1965 intended to do was to create rules whereby the states couldn't create these fly-by-night changes that would prohibit blacks from voting. What the court has done is essentially strip those protections, and so now the states are free to set the parameters of voting in those districts that have been problematic in the past. And the fear is, and Congressman John Lewis articulated this very well, what will happen, will there be any oversight now over those districts that historically have proven to be suspect when it comes to enforcing black voting?
All right, let me play devil's advocate. It's 50 years later, and I might even agree with Dee Dee on this one. It's 50 years later. We have the internet, we have media coverage, we have nonstop television news, is a more intelligent, informed electorate. It's not the 1960s, it's 2013, it's a whole different world, and maybe we don't need this. Jackie.
Frank, we have Paula Deen. If that doesn't remind you,
oh please, please do not put her in my camp.
No, that there is racial prejudice in the United States in the 200,000s, then nothing will. Look, when you take it back, yes, there was gerrymandering. I think that might go on now that they stripped away Section 4 and 5. There was a poll tax. I don't know if that will come back. It might. Early morning voting, which was traditionally the black hours to come out and vote. All of that now is not under any oversight.
All right, Dee Dee, Benkie, you chime in here. We know you want to.
Yeah, I mean, this is so outdated, and the Supreme Court is exactly right. You know, and I think, you know, to have Big Brother and have the federal government come in and oversee is just wrong at this point, because it is a different world now. You know, have the voting, and you have your clerk, and you have your judge, and you have a lot of, you have a different system where these things really can't happen, and they won't happen. So it's more fair for all the states to be saying.
Can you say definitively they won't happen?
Can you say definitively they will?
I can.
No, you
can't.
can't.
Because in the last year, it happened 10 times. Absolutely. And it was the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that stopped it.
In fact, there was a study done in the late 90s that indicated all the instances in which, as a prophylactic, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 has been very effective, perhaps the most effective means of ensuring that voter fraud doesn't take place in these counties and across the board.
No, wait a minute. That does not prevent voter fraud. No, what this is talking about is bullying and trying to keep suppressing
That's what we're talking about.
Which are fraud. I mean, if you look at it this way, let's be clear. The problem with allowing this to just be defined by the states is they haven't proved that they can move beyond politics. It's important to have that oversight. I agree that at some point we would hope that this legislation would not be necessary, that you don't need this oversight.
I'd be angry if on one of these states it's like, oh, wait a minute, you have to oversee me. The federal government's going to tell me what to do when another state doesn't. All the states should be the same. It should be.
They should be, and if there wasn't this history, and that's what people are missing here.
But it's ancient history. I'm
not
sorry.
Ancient
I know
at
you're
all.
not going
Well,
to say
the
it's
election
not,
of 2000. Remember those pregnant Chads in Florida?
It's a different world now, and the way
Different
you vote.
world.
Yes, it is.
Do you think that
Jackie, really?
Look, George
I'm
Zimmerman,
sorry.
do you think that there was that
Has
element of
nothing to do with this.
racism?
What
there was
are you
no
talking
racism
about?
in
We're
there?
talking about voter fraud. We're talking about voting being fair, and every state should have the same parameters.
And the
period.
things that make it unfair are things like racism.
And it's not the 60s anymore.
All right, well, let's talk about the Supreme Court ruling itself. Why do the justices focus on this one aspect of it and not either say it's all unconstitutional or all of it is constitutional? Why this one aspect? Why this partial ruling, do you think?
They focused on the formulas that were in Section 4, and the idea was that the formulas themselves were outdated. And you had Justice Roberts articulate in this majority opinion that, in fact, their feeling was it isn't the 1960s anymore, things have changed. What Justice Roberts, what Justice Ginsburg said in her dissenting opinion, this is very important, fails to appreciate, what the majority failed to appreciate is this simply a reflection of the fact that things have changed because this prophylactic is in place? If it's not in place, can we say things have changed? Some people say, well, you're trying to predict the weather in that instance. You're not, because we have a very clear indication over the last 10, 20, 30 years that without this legislation in place, we would see massive fraud, massive intimidation at the polls, massive problems that we saw that were associated with the 1960s. I point to voter problems in Ohio and Indiana in the last election that illustrate this, and the worst problems tend to occur in those states that made up the bulwark of the old Confederacy.
Well, we've seen some of these rules where you need an ID, a national ID card before you can vote, and a lot of people, especially the disadvantaged and older, don't have these ID cards because they don't drive. Or occasionally, are they being disenfranchised? And do you see that this opens the door to maybe more of that, Jackie?
Well, say that you didn't have a picture ID and you were 90 years old.
Yes.
Would you go up to that polling place and say, well, I don't have it, and then risk being turned away?
Good question.
Yeah.
Professor, what do you think?
It's the same issue. Jackie mentioned things like the poll tax. There was a literacy test at one point. So
Yes.
what are the qualifications going to be to be able to get this voter ID? These are all questions that have to be worked out, and we have to look at this very carefully. If the states are left to determine what this procedure is, what's the oversight to ensure that that procedure is fair?
We have 1 minute. Do you think Congress steps in and rectifies this, or do you think Congress leaves it alone?
Oh my God, this Congress, if President Obama said plastic, they'd say paper.
Yeah, forget it. It's gone.
So you
Nothing's
think-
going to get done.
Oh, no, it's gone. This is not going to change.
Just-
And in fact, I don't think they went far enough. I agree with Clarence Thomas. They should have gone further. And furthermore, because every state should have the voter ID law, so everyone should have an ID to vote. And it's very easy for those elderly to go with the state, and they will send you an ID. It's not hard at all.
Oh, come on.
It's
Look,
really
no,
not.
we're-
And you know what? And that's what prevents voter fraud, is making sure that that's the voter. And that's what happened in Indiana. I'm from Indiana. I know what happened in Indiana. There's a lot of voter fraud. It was because there wasn't voter ID.
There's
We
a
haven't
lot of
gone
voter
far
fraud
enough.
nationally, and that's why we need some type of oversight to
Not
ensure.
this, by the states' rights, the states' rights issue.
The states have proven unwilling and unable
In the
to do
60s,
this.
it's 2013.
Even well, you just mentioned Indiana and Ohio.
yeah,
even today.
but it was a different thing. It's
I
a
w- I
voter
wish
fraud,
we had-
and they're in jail now, by the way.
Another lively discussion. I wish we had more time. Dee Dee Benkie, thank you for joining us in this segment. Yohuru Williams, professor, thank you very much. And of course, the professor of media expert, Jackie Guzda, thank you very much. Pleasure.
Thank you, Frank.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll talk some more about, we're going to talk some more about this important issue. Okay, we'll take another segment. We'll be back in just a moment. Stick around.